Daniel Carter had spent his entire life fixing cars, barely making enough to keep his small repair shop running. One rainy evening, a luxury car sputtered to a stop in front of his garage. The woman inside, drenched from the storm, looked frustrated but also lost, as if she carried a burden heavier than the broken vehicle. Without hesitation, Daniel helped her, refusing extra payment. To him, kindness wasn't a transaction. It was just the right thing to do. What he didn't know was that the woman he had just helped wasn't just anyone. She was Eleanor Sinclair, a billionaire searching for something money couldn't buy, a man with a truly good heart. By the time Daniel realized who she was, his life would never be the same again. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The heavy scent of motor oil and rust lingered in the air, mixing with the distant hum of the highway. Daniel Carter stood at the entrance of Carter's garage, wiping the grease from his hands with a tattered rag. His body ached, his muscles stiff from another grueling day under the hood of broken-down cars that their owners could barely afford to fix. The shop, small and worn from years of relentless work, was his father's legacy, a place built not just on repairs, but on trust. But trust didn't pay the bills. Daniel exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple, as he glanced at the stack of overdue notices on his workbench. Rent was past due. The electricity bill loomed over him like a ticking time bomb. He had turned down a quick payday just this morning, refusing to overcharge a struggling single mom who had come in with a busted radiator. "Just patch it up, Daniel. I can't afford a new one," she had pleaded, her voice thick with exhaustion. And so he had. No charge. Again. Now, standing alone in the dim light of the flickering garage sign, he wondered how much longer he could keep doing this. How much longer he could sacrifice his own stability for the sake of his conscience. A gust of wind rattled the half-broken door, and he shivered, rolling his stiff shoulders. It was late, past closing, but he wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. His hands craved the distraction of work, something, anything, to keep his mind from spiraling into the pit of financial anxiety. Just as he reached for his wrench, a sudden sputtering noise cut through the quiet night. Headlights flashed against the damp pavement, and a sleek, black luxury car limped into view, its engine coughing before shutting off completely. Daniel straightened, squinting against the rain as the driver's side door swung open. A woman stepped out. Tall, wrapped in a dark coat, her hair clung to her face, drenched from the storm. There was something about the way she hesitated, how she lingered beside the car, as if debating whether she had made a mistake coming here. She wasn't from around here. That much was obvious. Daniel tossed his rag aside and stepped forward. "Looks like you're having a rough night," he said, his voice steady, despite the chill. The woman exhaled, half laughing, half defeated. "You have no idea." He didn't, but he was about to. The storm had rolled in fast. The sky, once clear, was now a churning mass of dark clouds, lightning slashing through the night like jagged cracks in a broken mirror. Rain pounded the pavement, turning the road outside Carter's garage into a slick, glistening mess. Daniel Carter had been just about to lock up when the low, sputtering growl of an engine cut through the downpour. His head snapped up. The vehicle barely made it past the entrance before jerking to a halt, its headlights flickering like a dying breath. A black luxury sedan, its sleek body now drenched, steam rising from beneath the hood. Definitely not the kind of car that usually ended up at his shop. Daniel wiped his wet hands on his jeans, watching as the driver's side door creaked open. A woman stepped out. Even through the rain, he could tell she didn't belong in a place like this. She moved with an air of practiced composure, but there was tension in her shoulders, a hesitance in the way she glanced around, as if second-guessing her decision to stop here. Her dark coat was already soaked, strands of wet hair clinging to her face, her fingers tightening into fists, as she stared at her broken-down car like it had personally betrayed her. She cursed under her breath. Daniel took a slow breath. This wasn't some lost traveler looking for directions. This woman, whoever she was upset. Not just frustrated at the car, but something deeper, something that had nothing to do with the storm. He stepped forward, careful not to startle her. "Looks like you're having a rough night." She turned, eyes locking onto his. They were sharp, assessing, but beneath them was exhaustion, as if she'd been carrying a weight too heavy for too long. "You have no idea," she murmured, barely audible over the rain. Daniel nodded toward the car. "Pop the hood. Let's see what we're dealing with." For a moment she hesitated. Then, with a reluctant sigh, she reached inside and pulled the lever. The latch clicked. Daniel stepped closer, rain drenching his shirt as he lifted the hood and peered inside. Steam rose, the engine hissing in protest. Whatever this woman had been running from, her car had finally decided it wasn't going to take her any further. And judging by the way she wrapped her arms around herself, staring blankly at the night, she wasn't sure if she wanted to keep going either. Rain dripped from Daniel's hair as he peered into the engine bay, his trained eyes scanning the tangle of metal, wires, and hoses. Even through the thick steam rising from the engine, he spotted the issue within seconds. Something simple, something that should have been caught before the car ever hit the road. A cracked radiator hose leaking just enough coolant to send the whole system into panic mode. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that couldn't be patched up. He exhaled, wiping the water from his face with the back of his hand before glancing at the woman. She stood stiffly beside the car, arms crossed, her gaze distant. She wasn't shivering, but he could see the way her fingers flexed against her coat, as if she was trying to hold something in. He didn't ask. Whatever had her out here in the middle of a storm, whatever weight she carried, it wasn't his business. "You're lucky," he finally said, straightening. "Could have been worse. Hose is cracked, probably been leaking slow for a while. I can patch it up enough to get you where you need to go." Her eyes snapped to his. "How long will it take?" 15, 20 minutes. She exhaled sharply, nodding. "Fine." She didn't say thank you. Not that Daniel expected it. He just grabbed his tools and got to work, ignoring the rain soaking through his clothes. His fingers moved quickly, cutting away the damaged section of hose, securing it tight with a temporary fix that would hold until she got a proper replacement. A job like this, a temporary fix, wasn't much. But the woman wasn't moving. She stood there, unmoving in the rain, watching him with an unreadable expression. "You can wait inside," he offered. "It's warmer." "I'm fine." Daniel didn't press. He just focused on his work, the rhythmic tightening of clamps, the slow drip of coolant mixing with the rain. Within minutes, the job was done. He wiped his hands on his jeans and closed the hood with a solid clank. "That should hold for a while," he said, stepping back. "You'll need a new hose soon, but you should be good for tonight." She pulled out her purse. "How much?" Daniel shook his head. "Don't worry about it." Her brows furrowed. "What?" "No charge." She blinked. "You just spent 20 minutes in the rain fixing my car. I can pay you." Daniel shrugged. "I know you can. But I didn't do it for the money." For the first time since she arrived, something in her expression cracked. Just for a second. A flicker of confusion, maybe even disbelief. "You're serious?" "I wouldn't be standing here drenched if I wasn't." Silence. She stared at him like he was some kind of puzzle she couldn't quite figure out. Then, with a slow nod, she slipped her wallet back into her purse. "Thank you," she said quietly. Daniel just gave a half smile. "Drive safe." She didn't leave right away. She lingered, hands gripping the wheel, eyes flicking to him through the rain-streaked window before she finally pulled out of the lot. And as Daniel stood there, watching the taillights disappear into the night, he had the strangest feeling. That wasn't just another customer, and this wasn't the last time he'd be seeing her. Eleanor's fingers drummed absently on the leather steering wheel as she pulled her car into a quiet spot across the street from Carter's garage. She hadn't planned to come back, not like this, not this soon. And yet, here she was, parked in the shadows, watching through the rain-speckled windshield as Daniel moved through his small, cluttered shop working on another beat-up car. She had told herself she was only here to make sure the fix had held, but that was a lie. Something about him had unsettled her that night, not in a bad way, but in a way she couldn't quite explain. She had met men who threw money around like it meant nothing, who only did things for others when there was something to gain. But Daniel, he had helped her without hesitation, without expectation. Who did that? A bell jingled as an older man hobbled into the shop, shaking the rain off his coat. Eleanor couldn't hear what was being said, but she saw the way Daniel greeted him, like an old friend rather than a customer. The man handed him a set of keys, speaking with tired eyes and hesitant movements. Then Eleanor saw it, the quiet exchange, the subtle shake of Daniel's head, the way he clapped a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder. He was refusing payment. Again. She frowned. Daniel disappeared into the garage bay, already getting to work, and Eleanor leaned back in her seat, exhaling slowly. This place was nothing like her world. It was small, simple, worn at the edges, but it felt full, alive. There was no pretense, no one trying to prove their worth with expensive suits or desperate charm. And Daniel, he belonged here. She didn't understand it. For years, she had been surrounded by men who flaunted their wealth, who whispered empty promises over candlelit dinners, who viewed kindness as a weakness. And yet, here was this man, standing in the cold, grease on his hands, drenched in rain and responsibility, and somehow he seemed richer than any of them, a mechanic, a man who had nothing and yet somehow had everything. She should have driven away. Instead, she stayed, watching, wondering. The rhythmic clanking of metal echoed through the shop as Daniel tightened the last bolt, his fingers moving with practiced ease. He barely noticed the grease on his hands anymore, just another part of him, like the scars on his knuckles or the calluses on his palms. Across the shop, Eleanor stood near the workbench watching him. She had asked him a question, something simple. Why do you do it? At first he had shrugged off the question, brushing it aside like oil on a rag. But she didn't let it go, so now, as he wiped his hands clean, he let out a slow breath and answered. "This garage," he said, motioning to the old walls, the mismatched tools, the faded sign that still bore his father's name, was never supposed to be mine. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, intrigued but silent, letting him speak. "My dad built this place from nothing, came to this town with empty pockets and a toolbox. People told him he wouldn't make it, that he should work for someone else, punch a clock, chase a paycheck. But he refused. He believed in doing things right, not just fast." Daniel's gaze flickered toward the far corner of the shop where an old rusted wrench sat on a shelf, untouched but never forgotten. "I used to sit on that stool over there when I was a kid, watching him work late into the night. He never turned anyone away, even when we barely had enough to keep the lights on. He told me once that money was a tool, nothing more, that a good man never lets greed decide what kind of work he does." His jaw tensed slightly, a shadow crossing his face. "He died 6 years ago, heart attack, just collapsed right over there." He gestured to the garage floor, the memory of that night still fresh despite the passing years. Eleanor didn't look away. She didn't fill the silence with empty words. She just listened. "I took over after that," Daniel continued, his voice quieter now. "Not because I wanted to, but because I couldn't let this place die with him. Thought maybe I could keep it running the way he did, but I learned real fast that honesty doesn't make you rich." He gave a dry, humorless chuckle. "I've had chances, big ones, to sell out, charge more than I should, cut corners, squeeze every last dollar out of the people who walk through that door. But if I did that, I wouldn't be honoring him. I'd be destroying everything he built." Eleanor's expression was unreadable, but something in her eyes softened. "So yeah," Daniel said, exhaling sharply, "that's why I do it. Not because it's easy, Not because it makes sense, but because some things are worth more than money. For a long moment she didn't respond. Then finally she said, "That's rare." Daniel gave a small, tired smile. "Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out." The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red as Eleanor drove through the quiet streets, her hands tight on the wheel. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflective, mirroring the thoughts spinning inside her head. She should have been focused on the meeting she had tomorrow, the contracts waiting for her signature, the billion-dollar deals that demanded her attention. But all she could think about was the mechanic. Daniel Carter. It made no sense. Men in her world didn't work with their hands. They didn't spend their nights covered in grease, turning wrenches, fixing things because it was the right thing to do instead of the profitable thing to do. The people she knew, men who wore tailored suits and sat in glass offices, never did anything without an angle. And yet, Daniel had refused her money. Even now, hours later, she felt the weight of that moment, the way he had just shrugged, brushing off her attempt to pay him like it meant nothing, as if her money, her power, held no value to him. She had never met anyone like that before. Her fingers drummed against the leather steering wheel as she pulled into the underground parking garage of her building, a towering structure of steel and glass that screamed success. The security guard nodded as she passed, but she barely noticed. Inside the elevator, she caught her reflection in the mirrored walls, poised, polished, unreadable, the same look she had perfected for years. But for the first time in a long time, she felt unsettled. Inside her penthouse, floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the skyline, a view people paid millions for, but to Eleanor, it just felt empty. She slipped off her coat, draping it over the back of a chair, then poured herself a drink, swirling the amber liquid in the glass. What was it about that man? She could forget about him, move on. He was just a mechanic in a small-town garage, a man who had no idea who she really was. And yet, something told her that wasn't the last time she would see him. Something told her she wasn't ready to walk away just yet. The boardroom was silent save for the faint ticking of the antique clock mounted on the wall. Eleanor sat at the head of the long glass table, a sea of executives on either side of her, all waiting for her verdict on the proposal in front of her. The numbers were good, the projections promising. A multi-million-dollar deal that, once signed, would increase their reach, solidify their dominance in yet another sector. But Eleanor wasn't paying attention. She was nodding at the right moments, her expression unreadable, her voice steady. But in the back of her mind, all she could see was grease-stained hands, a quiet strength in stormy blue eyes, and the stubborn integrity of a man who refused money like it meant nothing. "Miss Sinclair?" She blinked, her focus snapping back to the present. The room was waiting, expecting her signature. "Proceed," she said smoothly, reaching for her pen and signing the papers with practiced ease. The executives exchanged pleased glances, satisfied that their CEO was, as always, in control. As the meeting adjourned, Eleanor stood, gathering her things, but before she could step out, her assistant, Caroline, was already by her side. "Your schedule is packed for the next 2 weeks," Caroline started, flipping through her tablet. "You have the investor dinner tonight, then back-to-back meetings tomorrow, followed by, I need you to find someone." Eleanor's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Caroline stopped, lifted her gaze. "Who?" "A mechanic." Caroline blinked, thrown for the first time in years. Sorry, did you say a mechanic?" "Yes." Eleanor kept walking, leading them through the marble-floored hallway. "His name is Daniel Carter. He owns a small garage on the outskirts of town. I want to know everything about him." Caroline hesitated, then quickly jotted notes. "Are we talking a standard background check or—" "Discreet," Eleanor said, stepping into the elevator, her tone leaving no room for discussion. "I just want to understand him, who he is, what he values, how a man like that still exists." Caroline studied her boss carefully. Eleanor Sinclair was known for being calculated, precise. She never wasted time on anything that didn't serve a purpose, and yet there was something different in her expression now, a flicker of curiosity, or maybe something more. Caroline simply nodded. "I'll take care of it." Eleanor didn't respond, only exhaled as the elevator doors slid shut. She had spent years surrounded by the best money could buy, luxury, power, influence, yet, somehow, none of it intrigued her the way that mechanic did, and she intended to find out why. The black sedan rolled up to Carter's garage in the early evening, its engine humming smoothly as it came to a stop in the same spot where it had broken down just nights ago. This time there was no storm, no frantic desperation, just a calculated decision and a woman determined to get answers. Eleanor hesitated, fingers resting lightly on the wheel. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind, played out every possible scenario. She told herself this was just another business assessment, no different from analyzing a potential investment or vetting a partnership. Except this time, the asset she was scrutinizing wasn't a company. It was a man, Daniel Carter. She took a breath, exhaled, and stepped out of the car. Inside the garage, Daniel was bent over the open hood of an old pickup truck, hands deep in its engine, his forearms streaked with oil. He didn't look up immediately, only muttered something to the teenager standing beside him, a local kid who seemed to be learning the trade. "Pass me the wrench." "No, the other one." The kid handed it over, and with a few precise movements, Daniel tightened something under the hood before finally straightening. His gaze flicked towards Eleanor, brows lifting in mild surprise. "Well," he said, wiping his hands on a rag, "didn't think I'd see you again so soon." Eleanor kept her expression neutral, tilting her head toward the car. "It's making a strange noise." Daniel arched an eyebrow. "What kind of noise?" "A clicking sound." It was vague enough to sound believable, though she had no idea if cars even made clicking sounds when something was wrong. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't question it. Instead, he sighed and tossed the rag over his shoulder. "Pop the hood. Let's take a look." She did as he asked, watching as he leaned in, inspecting the engine with the same careful precision she had seen before. His fingers traced along the belts and hoses, his brow furrowing. After a long pause, he stepped back and looked at her. "There's nothing wrong with your car." Eleanor froze. Daniel didn't look smug or accusatory, just tired, like he had seen this before. "Are you sure?" she asked, keeping her tone light. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Yeah, I'm sure. Everything's fine." He studied her for a moment, then added, "You don't have to make up car trouble if you just wanted to stop by, you know." Eleanor's pulse ticked up, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she simply shrugged. "So you're not going to charge me for wasting your time?" Daniel let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Not my style." And just like that, she had her answer. He was exactly who he seemed to be. The question now was, what did she do with that? Daniel was already moving on. Whatever game Eleanor was playing, he wasn't interested in it. He wiped his hands on the rag slung over his shoulder, giving her a small, knowing look before turning his attention back to the old pickup truck on the lift. "Let me guess," he said, voice dry. "You're going to tell me you suddenly remembered the clicking noise?" Eleanor folded her arms, watching him carefully. "You're really not going to charge me anything?" Daniel exhaled, shaking his head with an easy shrug. "Nope." She studied him, searching for any sign of hesitation, any flicker of regret in his eyes. But there was nothing. No resentment, no frustration, no feeling of being cheated. Just a man who didn't seem to care about squeezing every dollar out of the people who walked into his garage. The door jingled, and both of them turned as a frazzled woman stepped inside, cradling a little girl against her hip. The child, no older than 4, had her face buried in her mother's shoulder, her tiny arms curled around her neck. "Daniel, I know I'm late on the last payment," the woman started, her voice shaking, "but my car won't start, and I don't have anyone else to—" Daniel waved her off before she could finish. "Renee, stop. It's fine." "Where is it?" The woman hesitated, glancing at Eleanor as if only now realizing someone else was in the shop. Eleanor recognized that look. Embarrassment, desperation. It was the kind of expression she'd seen too many times at corporate meetings when struggling businesses came to beg for last chances. Daniel didn't bat an eye. He was already moving, grabbing his jacket. "Let me get my toolbox. I'll take a look." "Daniel, He turned back, his voice softer this time. "Renee, I got it. Don't worry about the money right now. Let's just get you back on the road, yeah?" The woman's eyes filled with gratitude, and she nodded, blinking fast. Eleanor said nothing, only watched as Daniel grabbed what he needed and disappeared out into the cold. This man, this mechanic, who had nothing, kept giving. And for the first time in years, Eleanor felt something unexpected crack through the armor she had built around herself, something she couldn't quite name. The invitation was simple, almost too casual to be taken seriously. A text, just one line. "Daniel, I'd like you to join me at a small gathering tomorrow night. Nothing formal, I promise." It was sent after hours when the city lights glittered coldly against the sky, and Eleanor sat alone in her penthouse, staring out into the night. There was a tension in her chest, an inexplicable pull toward the man she barely knew, but whose actions had unsettled her in ways she couldn't ignore. She told herself it was just curiosity, nothing more. She was simply testing him, seeing how someone like him would react to a world so far removed from his own. She needed to know if he could blend in, if his kindness was genuine or just a mask. The next evening, Daniel walked into the venue, and the moment he crossed the threshold, he felt it. The shift, the weight of the place settled over him like a cold blanket, making him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't shake. The grand hall was nothing like the garage. Here, everything gleamed. Polished floors, towering chandeliers, art on every wall that cost more than he made in a year. The laughter of the elite swirled around him, their voices rising above the hum of string music, their smiles too practiced, too perfect. But Daniel wasn't here for the art or the lavish setting. He was here for her. Eleanor stood across the room, a picture of elegance. Her dress shimmered in the soft light, the kind of gown that told you everything you needed to know about wealth, status, and power. She spotted him and smiled, a hint of something he couldn't place in her expression. "Daniel?" she greeted, her voice smooth, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "I'm glad you could make it," he nodded, his gaze scanning the room before settling back on her. "I wasn't sure what to expect." Her smile deepened, but there was something more in it now, something that made his stomach tighten. "You seem to be fitting in just fine." He raised an eyebrow, glancing at the guests around them. "I'm not sure I'd call this fitting in." Eleanor chuckled softly, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's just a gathering, Daniel. Nothing more." The room felt like it was closing in on him as she led him further inside, introducing him to faces he knew only by reputation. He shook hands with men whose names meant millions, exchanged polite pleasantries with women whose beauty was rivaled only by their apparent indifference. Every word, every smile felt calculated. And then Eleanor did it. She placed him right in front of the most powerful man in the room, the one who ran half the city's assets, the kind of man whose handshake was more valuable than most people's entire lives. Daniel didn't flinch, didn't try to play the part. He simply held out his hand, meeting the man's eyes with the same unwavering honesty that had defined him all his life. Eleanor watched it all with quiet intensity, her heart twisting in a way she wasn't prepared for. This wasn't the man she expected. She had been waiting for him to falter, to be overwhelmed by the wealth around him. But he wasn't. He wasn't fazed. And for the first time, Eleanor felt her walls start to crumble. Daniel stood at the entrance of the lavish hall, the thick gold-framed doors looming in front of him like an invitation he wasn't sure he wanted to accept. He wasn't used to places like this, places where the air was thick with perfume and the clinking of crystal glasses. The guests drifted around him in their designer suits and flowing gowns, all carrying the weight of their wealth like it was a cloak they wore to ward off the common folk. And here he was, in his worn leather jacket and boots that had seen better days, feeling like a fish caught in the most foreign of waters. He adjusted the collar of his jacket, trying to make himself less conspicuous, but it didn't work. The walls seemed to close in around him, and every polite glance from the others felt like a quiet judgment. He had never been someone who cared about appearances, but this was different. As he walked further into the room, the music from the string quartet seemed to grow louder, the conversations around him growing more distant, like he was hearing everything from behind glass. He could see Eleanor across the room, effortlessly fitting in, as if she had been born into this world, greeting everyone with the practiced ease of someone who had never felt out of place. Her eyes scanned the room, catching sight of him, and she smiled. She was beautiful, poised, completely in control. And here he was, a mechanic with grease under his nails, wondering why he ever agreed to this. "Daniel," she called out, her voice pulling him back to reality. She waved him over with a slight tilt of her head, her smile never faltering. He walked over, trying to keep his movements smooth, but it felt like his every step was too heavy, too loud. As he approached her, he could see the small crowd gathered around her, all wearing expressions that hovered somewhere between polite interest and quiet disdain. The tension in his chest tightened. "Don't worry," Eleanor said softly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "You're doing fine." Daniel wanted to believe her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. Every inch of him screamed that this wasn't his world. These people didn't fix cars for a living. They bought them, traded them, drove them for status. He wasn't even sure if they understood what it meant to work with your hands, to get your nails dirty in the name of survival. "So," one of the men beside Eleanor said, his voice dripping with arrogance as he gave Daniel an appraising look, "what exactly do you do again?" Daniel didn't flinch, but the question hit him like a slap. "I fix cars," he said simply, his voice steady, though inside his nerves were raw. The man smirked, as if trying to suppress a laugh. "Oh, how quaint." Eleanor shot the man a look, her smile faltering for just a moment, before turning back to Daniel. "Ignore him. Come, meet the others." But as they walked through the crowd, Daniel felt more and more like an outsider, an illusion of civility wrapped around a truth he couldn't escape. He didn't belong here. And deep down, he knew Eleanor wasn't trying to change that. She was testing it. The room pulsed with energy, the sharp laughter of the wealthy mingling with the soft strains of the orchestra. The guests surrounded Eleanor, a circle of polished smiles and well-practiced charm, all trying to outdo one another to secure a word with her, a moment of attention. They spoke with the ease of those who had been born into the game, their voices smooth and rehearsed, as if they had learned from the best. Their gestures were deliberate, their postures immaculate. The men wore expensive suits with crisp lines, while the women glided in gowns that shimmered with status. And then there was Daniel. He stood slightly apart from them, trying his best to seem invisible, to avoid the sharp glances and the subtle mockery. The laughter around him felt hollow, like the sound of a well-rehearsed play. Every word seemed calculated, every smile just a little too wide. No one spoke to him, no one even acknowledged his presence, not unless they were sizing him up, as if trying to place him. What could a mechanic from nowhere possibly have in common with people like them? "I've had chances, big ones, to sell out. Charge more than I should, cut corners, squeeze every last dollar out of the people who walk through that door. But if I did that, I wouldn't be honoring him. I'd be destroying everything he built." Eleanor's expression was unreadable, but something in her eyes softened. "So yeah," Daniel said, exhaling sharply. "That's why I do it. Not because it's easy, not because it makes sense, but because some things are worth more than money." For a long moment she didn't respond. Then finally she said, "That's rare." Daniel gave a small, tired smile. "Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out. The city lights blurred into streaks of gold and red as Eleanor drove through the quiet streets, her hands tight on the wheel. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and reflective, mirroring the thoughts spinning inside her head. She should have been focused on the meeting she had tomorrow, the contracts waiting for her signature, the billion-dollar deals that demanded her attention. But all she could think about was the mechanic, Daniel Carter. It made no sense. Men in her world didn't work with their hands. They didn't spend their nights covered in grease, turning wrenches, fixing things because it was the right thing to do instead of the profitable thing to do. The people she knew, men who wore tailored suits and sat in glass offices, never did anything without an angle. And yet, Daniel had refused her money. Even now, hours later, she felt the weight of that moment. The way he had just shrugged, brushing off her attempt to pay him like it meant nothing. As if her money, her power, held no value to him. She had never met anyone like that before. Her fingers drummed against the leather steering wheel as she pulled into the underground parking garage of her building, a towering structure of steel and glass that screamed success. The security guard nodded as she passed, but she barely noticed. Inside the elevator, she caught her reflection in the mirrored walls, poised, polished, unreadable. The same look she had perfected for years. But for the first time in a long time, she felt unsettled. Inside her penthouse, floor-to-ceiling windows showcased the skyline, a view people paid millions for. But to Eleanor, it just felt empty. She slipped off her coat, draping it over the back of a chair, then poured herself a drink, swirling the amber liquid in the glass. What was it about that man? She could forget about him, move on. He was just a mechanic in a small-town garage, a man who had no idea who she really was. And yet, something told her that wasn't the last time she would see him. Something told her she wasn't ready to walk away just yet. The boardroom was silent, save for the faint ticking of the antique clock mounted on the wall. Eleanor sat at the head of the long glass table, a sea of executives on either side of her, all waiting for her verdict on the proposal in front of her. The numbers were good, the projections promising. A multi-million-dollar deal that, once signed, would increase their reach, solidify their dominance in yet another sector. But Eleanor wasn't paying attention. She was nodding at the right moments, her expression unreadable, her voice steady. But in the back of her mind, all she could see was grease-stained hands, a quiet strength in stormy blue eyes, and the stubborn integrity of a man who refused money like it meant nothing. "Miss Sinclair?" She blinked, her focus snapping back to the present. The room was waiting, expecting her signature. "Proceed," she said smoothly, reaching for her pen and signing the papers with practiced ease. The executives exchanged pleased glances, satisfied that their CEO was, as always, in control. As the meeting adjourned, Eleanor stood, gathering her things, but before she could step out, her assistant, Caroline, was already by her side. "Your schedule is packed for the next 2 weeks," Caroline started, flipping through her tablet. "You have the investor dinner tonight, then back-to-back meetings tomorrow, followed by, I need you to find someone." Eleanor's voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. Caroline stopped, lifted her gaze. "Who?" "A mechanic." Caroline blinked, thrown for the first time in years. Sorry, did you say a mechanic?" "Yes." Eleanor kept walking, leading them through the marble-floored hallway. "His name is Daniel Carter. He owns a small garage on the outskirts of town. I want to know everything about him." Eleanor was at the center of it all, handling each conversation with the ease of someone who had been born for this world. The men around her leaned in too close, their words smooth but sharp, eager to charm her with their status, their wealth. They didn't know what to make of Daniel standing there awkwardly on the fringes. They didn't know how to place him. Daniel watched them from a distance. He could see the subtle flexing of power, the way they spoke of business deals as if they were casual banter, the way they measured each word, each glance, each moment of attention like it was currency. But Eleanor was different. Her eyes met his across the room, and for a second the noise of the crowd faded. There was something there, something she wasn't sharing with anyone else. She wasn't like them, and that realization hit him harder than he expected. Her smile faltered for just a second before she quickly masked it with another calculated laugh, turning back to the circle of men who were now crowding her space even more. Daniel's fingers tightened around his drink, but he didn't move. He didn't have to. He knew exactly what was happening. This was a world built on masks and games, a world where status was everything and kindness was a liability. He wasn't here to play that game. He wasn't here for their approval. And yet, as he watched her laugh, watched her slip back into their world of pretenses, a tight knot formed in his chest. He couldn't ignore the feeling that she was slowly slipping away, drawn back into a world that didn't need him. He felt out of place again, like a man who didn't belong in a room full of people who had never once questioned their own privilege. But he didn't flinch. He wouldn't. He wasn't the one who needed to change. Daniel stood near the edge of the group, feeling more and more like an intruder with every passing minute. The air in the room was thick with arrogance, as the wealthy men and women of the elite circle spoke in tones that dripped with entitlement, discussing luxury properties, yachts, and investments, as though those were the only things that mattered. Eleanor was still at the center, surrounded by suitors eager to win her favor, their smiles too wide, their laughter too loud. One of them, a man Daniel had seen earlier but hadn't spoken to, approached him with a smirk that immediately made Daniel uneasy. "So, Daniel," the man began, his voice smooth and dripping with condescension. "You're the mechanic, right?" Daniel glanced up from his drink, his eyebrows narrowing slightly. He had already had enough of the pretentious conversations, the way people spoke as though the world revolved around their wealth. But there was something different about the way this man spoke, something challenging. "Yeah," Daniel replied, his voice steady, though his fists clenched by his sides. "That's right." The man chuckled, his eyes flicking up and down Daniel's figure, taking in his worn clothes, the calluses on his hands, the faint dirt still clinging to his fingertips. "You know, it's fascinating," the man continued, leaning in just a little too close, "how people like you find their way into circles like this. Tell me, Daniel, do you really think you have anything in common with the kind of people Eleanor surrounds herself with? Or are you just here for the free drinks and hors d'oeuvres?" The words stung, but Daniel didn't flinch. He looked the man dead in the eyes, refusing to be intimidated by the sneer on his face. "I'm not here for your approval," Daniel said quietly, his tone cool, controlled. "I'm not here for anyone's approval." The man's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I'm just curious, that's all. You must be so out of your depth, coming to an event like this." Daniel didn't back down. Instead, he met the man's gaze, unwavering. "I'm not out of my depth. I'm just not pretending to be something I'm not." The man's eyes flickered with surprise, his arrogance momentarily cracked. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially by someone who wasn't part of his world. But Daniel wasn't intimidated. He wasn't going to play by their rules or fit into their idea of what success should look like. Eleanor, standing nearby, watched the exchange with an unreadable expression. Daniel could feel her eyes on him, but he didn't look at her. This wasn't about her anymore. It was about standing his ground, proving that no matter how much wealth or status a man had, it didn't define his worth. The man opened his mouth to say something more, but Daniel turned away, taking a slow step back. He didn't need to say anything else. In that moment, Daniel realized something important. This wasn't about the money or the power. It was about who you were when no one was watching. Eleanor stood across the room, watching Daniel as he moved through the crowd. There was something about him, something that stood out against the backdrop of polished suits and forced smiles. While the others around him played their games, talked their business, and subtly vied for attention, Daniel moved with a quiet confidence that was impossible to ignore. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He didn't need to. Her gaze lingered on him longer than she intended. He was leaning against the wall now, talking to one of the waiters, his voice low and steady, never raising in pitch or volume. Even in a room full of the richest people she knew, Daniel was in his element, calm, collected, and somehow completely unbothered. For the first time, Eleanor saw him as more than just the mechanic who had helped her that night. He wasn't some accidental part of her world. He was a presence, something grounded and steady in the midst of chaos. The other men in the room were loud, their voices carried, booming over everyone else, trying to dominate the conversation. Their eyes flickered to Eleanor constantly, seeking her approval, gauging her reaction, pretending to be something they weren't. But Daniel? He didn't look for approval. He didn't need her to validate him. It made her uncomfortable. She wasn't used to being around someone who didn't care about status, someone who wasn't trying to climb some invisible ladder, someone who wasn't obsessed with the next deal, the next opportunity. He wasn't here to please anyone. He wasn't here to impress her. And that realization hit her harder than she expected. As she watched him across the room, a shift happened inside her. She wasn't sure when it started. Maybe it was when he first helped her, refusing to take her money, or when he stood his ground against the arrogant man who mocked him. Maybe it was just watching him stand quietly in a room full of pretension, never bending, never showing the slightest sign of discomfort. Eleanor had spent years building a life surrounded by people who followed the rules, people who understood that the game was always about power, influence, and wealth. She was no different. But now, in the midst of all that, she saw Daniel, quiet, honest, unassuming, and something about him shattered the world she had spent so long crafting. The men who surrounded her with their sharp words and calculated moves seemed small in comparison. She hadn't realized how hollow their presence was until now. She didn't need them. She didn't need the status, the empty conversations, the games. For the first time, she realized that maybe, just maybe, she had been looking for something deeper all along. Her eyes stayed fixed on Daniel, and she felt a pull, a tug in her chest that she couldn't explain. He wasn't like anyone she had ever met, and the more she watched him, the more she realized she didn't want him to be. The check arrived without warning, slipped quietly under the door of Carter's garage early one morning. Daniel didn't see it at first. The day was already moving fast. Another car needing repairs, another customer who couldn't afford much but still relied on him to fix their car. Daniel was used to the grind. It was a familiar routine, late nights, early mornings, and keeping the lights on by sheer determination. But this morning, there was something different. When he opened the envelope, a slip of paper fluttered out. At first, he thought it was just another bill, another overdue notice. But when he saw the amount written on the check, his heart skipped a beat. $1,000. It was a lot for a man like him, more than he made in a week. And it came with no return address, no name, just the number, no note, no explanation. His first instinct was to toss it. He didn't want anyone's pity, certainly not some anonymous handout. It was the last thing he needed. If he took it, what did that say about him? That he couldn't make it on his own? That he needed charity to survive? No. He wouldn't be a part of that world. But as he stood there holding the check, the weight of it pulling at his chest, a thought nagged at him. The handwriting on the envelope. It was familiar. The sharp, delicate strokes, the precise way each letter was formed, felt almost like a signature. He shoved the check back into the envelope and went about his day, his mind racing. He couldn't understand it. Who would do this? As the day wore on, the shop quieted for a moment, and Daniel took a breather, leaning against the counter. His mind drifted to Eleanor. She had been on his mind more and more lately, ever since that night she'd come into the shop with the fake car problem. She had seemed so different, so out of place in her world of wealth. He had seen the way she watched him, the way she kept her distance, like she was trying to understand him, to figure him out. Could it be her? No, he dismissed the thought immediately. She didn't owe him anything. And besides, she had more important things to deal with, people who were far more important than a mechanic in a rundown garage. That night, when the shop closed, Daniel sat at the desk, staring at the check again. Something inside him broke. It wasn't the money that bothered him. It was the idea that someone saw him as someone who needed saving, someone who couldn't make it on his own. He couldn't accept it. He wouldn't. The next morning he took the check, drove to the local bank, and deposited it. The amount didn't matter. What mattered was that he could get by without it. That was the life he wanted: hard work, no handouts, just sweat and determination. But deep down, as he walked back to the garage, he couldn't shake the thought of who had given it to him. And for the first time, he felt a strange sense of confusion, like he was caught between two worlds. Maybe he wasn't the only one with something to prove. The air in Carter's garage was thick with the familiar smell of motor oil and grease as Daniel worked on yet another car that had seen better days. The hum of the small fan in the corner did little to cool the heat that clung to him, but it was nothing new. Another long day, another repair, another promise made to someone who could barely afford it. But there was something gnawing at the back of his mind, something he couldn't shake. It had started with that strange check, the anonymous gift that still left him with a sense of unease. He had refused it, of course. He didn't need charity. He didn't want charity. But as the days passed and he kept seeing Eleanor's face, her polite, distant smile, he couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to her than she let on. She had come into his life too suddenly. That night when her car broke down, when she looked at him with those eyes, too much like she was studying him, measuring him for something he couldn't figure out. And since then, she had come back to the shop, always with an excuse, this time a loose belt, that time a strange noise. Yet every time she seemed to need something, more than just her car fixed. At first he had dismissed it. She was just a rich woman trying to blend in with the people who could never truly understand her world. But now, the small doubts were starting to creep in, like a shadow in the corner of his mind that he couldn't chase away. Why did she keep coming back? Was she really just another customer, or was there something else behind her interest in him? He had caught her watching him a few times, a look in her eyes that wasn't just curiosity. It was something more, something deeper. Maybe it was guilt, maybe pity, maybe something he couldn't place. But whatever it was, it unsettled him. His fingers gripped the wrench tighter, the weight of his suspicions pressing against him. He couldn't understand why someone like her, someone who had everything, someone whose life was built on power and control, would care about a mechanic in a dusty old garage. The thought stayed with him all night, haunting him. Maybe she wasn't the person he thought she was. Maybe she was testing him, seeing if he was worthy of something he couldn't even understand. And then there was the gift, the check. It felt wrong, like a test he hadn't agreed to take. The idea that someone, especially someone like her, would look at him and think he needed help, it didn't sit well with him. The doubts were growing, and they were suffocating him. Every glance from her felt like another challenge he didn't know how to face. He couldn't keep denying it. Eleanor Sinclair was playing a game, and he wasn't sure he even knew the rules. It was late when she came in. Daniel had just finished locking up the garage for the night, the low hum of the city outside filling the silence. He was ready to call it a day, ready to put the events of the past week behind him. The gift, the strange behavior, the nagging suspicion that something wasn't right. It had all been eating away at him. He was just about to pull the door shut when he saw her again. Eleanor. She stood outside, framed by the dim streetlight, her silhouette barely visible against the rain. For a moment, Daniel hesitated. He had been avoiding her, had been convincing himself that he didn't need to know what she was really after. But there she was, looking as out of place as ever, standing in front of his shop like she belonged here, like she had any right to be part of his world. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there, her eyes fixed on him, as if waiting for him to make the first move. "Not your usual place to be, is it?" Daniel asked, the words sharp, more defensive than he intended. Eleanor gave a small smile, but there was no warmth in it. I know you've been avoiding me, she said quietly, taking a step forward, her heels clicking against the wet pavement. And I understand why. He didn't say anything, just watched her with a wary gaze, trying to piece it together. Why was she here? What was it she wanted from him? She paused, the tension between them hanging thick in the air. Then, with a deep breath, she finally spoke. I'm not just some rich woman looking to throw my money around, she said, her voice calm but laced with a vulnerability that caught him off guard. I'm not here to play games or make myself feel good by helping the little people. I didn't come here because I needed something from you, Daniel. I came because I needed something from myself. His heart skipped a beat. What's that supposed to mean? Eleanor looked away for a moment, her gaze drifting to the garage behind him. She hesitated, as if weighing whether to reveal more, but finally her eyes met his again. I'm a billionaire, she said, her voice almost too quiet. You probably guessed that already. But what you don't know is that I've spent my life surrounded by people who only care about what I can give them, my wealth, my status. They're all interested in the things I can provide, the power I represent. I've been alone for so long, Daniel, alone in a crowd of people who don't know me, who don't even care to know the real me. Daniel stood still, the weight of her words pressing on him. It felt like she was laying herself bare, exposing parts of herself she'd never shared before. I didn't expect anything from you, she continued, her voice a little stronger now, but still full of rawness. I didn't want your money. I just wanted to see someone who could look at me like I was something more than just a name, someone who didn't care about my bank account or what I could do for them. I needed to see if there was anyone left who could see me for who I am, not what I have. Daniel's chest tightened. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. All the walls he had built around himself, all the doubts, all the anger, it crumbled in an instant, and he felt the raw vulnerability in her words. I'm sorry, she whispered, the apology hanging heavy between them. I should have been honest with you sooner. Daniel looked at her, at the woman who had appeared out of nowhere, shattering everything he thought he knew. She wasn't some rich woman looking to test him. She was just lost. And for the first time he realized that maybe he wasn't the only one trying to find something real. Daniel stood frozen, the rain beginning to fall heavier now, as Eleanor's words hung in the air like a weight he couldn't shake off. A billionaire, alone in a world of people who only saw the money. It sounded real enough, but everything about it felt off. She had been watching him, testing him all along. The gift, the subtle questions, the way she'd come back time after time, it all added up now, and it made him feel like a pawn in some game he hadn't agreed to play. He took a slow step back, trying to breathe through the confusion, the anger rising in him like a tidal wave. She had looked at him with those eyes, like she saw something in him that no one else could, and maybe for a moment he believed it. But now, as the rain soaked through his jacket, he could see it clearly. Eleanor had never been honest with him. She hadn't come to him out of kindness. She'd come because she was curious, because she wanted to see if he would bend to the weight of her world. You used me, he finally said, his voice thick with disbelief. All this time you just wanted to see if I'd fall for it, if I'd fall for you. Eleanor's face twisted in a flash of pain, but it was gone almost immediately, replaced by a defensive calm. Daniel, that's not what I— No, he cut her off, his anger bubbling over now. You don't get to do this. You don't get to walk into my life, make me feel like I matter, only to pull the rug out from under me when it's convenient for you. The words stung, and she took a step back, her eyes wide with surprise. He could see the hesitation in her, the way she was trying to understand, to justify her actions. But it didn't matter. He was done listening. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, frustration building in his chest. You've been nothing but a reminder of everything I can't have. You walk in here with your perfect life, your perfect world, and pretend like any of it means something. I'm not a project. I'm not a charity case for you to fix." She opened her mouth, but he held up a hand, silencing her. "Don't. Don't say anything else. I don't know who you are anymore." Without another word, Daniel turned and walked away, each step heavier than the last, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back, not when he heard her calling his name, not when he heard the desperate edge in her voice. He didn't trust her anymore. The walls he had built around himself were stronger now than ever, and no matter how hard she tried, no matter how much she claimed she wanted something real, it didn't change what she had done. The cold rain hit his face, but it didn't wash away the bitter taste of betrayal. He kept walking, faster now, trying to escape the knot in his stomach, the voice in his head telling him he had made a mistake. But he didn't want to listen. He couldn't. Because for the first time in his life, Daniel was starting to wonder if trusting anyone, especially her, was ever really worth it. Eleanor stood in the cold rain, watching the fading silhouette of Daniel as he disappeared down the street. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat feeling heavier than the last. She had tried to explain, tried to tell him the truth. But now, as the distance between them grew, she realized how badly she had messed up, how everything she had feared, everything she had tried so hard to avoid, had come to pass. She had pushed him away, and she could feel it deep in her gut. She had been so wrapped up in her own world, so desperate for something real, that she hadn't stopped to consider what her actions were doing to him. The thought hit her like a slap. What if he was the one person who had ever truly seen her? Not the wealth, not the status, not the name that opened doors, just her. Eleanor Sinclair, a woman trapped in a life where everyone wanted something from her, and no one ever bothered to ask what she needed. She had been so sure that if she played the game right, if she could just show him who she really was, he'd understand. He'd see the woman underneath all the layers of expectation and illusion, but now she saw it. He had been honest with her from the start. He never wanted anything from her. He just wanted to know her. And she had turned that into a test, a challenge to be won. And now it was too late. The sting of the realization cut deeper than any insult or rejection she had ever faced. She wasn't just losing him as a man in her life. She was losing the only person who had ever treated her like she was worth more than just what she could give. She had spent so much time pretending, hiding behind the walls of her wealth, that she hadn't stopped to think about how it made her seem, how it made him feel. She had seen his hesitation, his discomfort in her world, but instead of giving him space, she had pushed him further, trying to prove something she wasn't even sure of. She glanced at the garage, now dark and empty, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp. A place he had worked so hard to build, a place where he felt valued, where he belonged. She had thought her world could somehow fit into his, but in the end, it had only alienated him. Eleanor took a deep breath, the cold air stinging her lungs. She had lost him, and in the silence that followed, she realized that the price of her games, her tests, had been far too high. The rain had finally stopped, but the heavy feeling in Daniel's chest remained. He hadn't gone home right away. Instead, he found himself at the old diner just outside of town, sitting in a booth by the window, watching the world pass by. The street lights cast long shadows, but all he could see was Eleanor, her face, the way her words had twisted into something he couldn't untangle. He wasn't sure why he came here. Maybe he needed to clear his head. Maybe he needed to figure out what went wrong. He hadn't even realized how long he'd been sitting there until he heard the familiar sound of the doorbell jingling. Tom, an old friend from high school, slid into the booth across from him, a grin on his face despite the fact that Daniel had barely looked up when he walked in. Tom was one of the few people Daniel still talked to from his past, a guy who knew him before the garage, before all the years of hard work and failed attempts to make something of himself. "Well, if it isn't the elusive Daniel Carter," Tom said, pulling off his jacket. "What's got you looking like someone stole your last wrench?" Daniel didn't smile, He just stared at his coffee cup, swirling the liquid absent-mindedly. "It's nothing." Tom didn't buy it. "Come on. I know you. You don't look like nothing." "What happened?" For a moment, Daniel hesitated, then leaned back in his seat, letting out a long breath. He glanced out the window again, but the streets weren't what he was seeing. He saw Eleanor, her face, her eyes, the way she had tried to explain herself, and yet he still didn't understand. "I met someone," Daniel began, his voice rough. "A woman. She seemed real, you know? But I was wrong. She was just like the rest of them." Tom raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean, like the rest of them? You've never cared about that stuff." "I know," Daniel said, his hands tightening into fists. "But she made me believe that maybe I could have something more, something real. She came into my life, acted like she understood me, and then just pulled away. It was like I was some kind of test, a project, and now I'm questioning everything." Tom watched him, his expression softening. "You're thinking too much, man. People screw up, sure. Hell, I've done it 1,000 times. But you can't let one person ruin your whole idea of what's real." Daniel shook his head. "I don't know. Maybe I should have just given her a chance." "You don't owe her anything," Tom replied firmly. "You did what you thought was right. You didn't let her take advantage of you, and that's something most people can't say. You walked away because you saw something wasn't right. That's not weakness, Daniel. That's strength." Daniel didn't say anything for a long time. Tom's words settled in the silence, slowly creeping into his mind, unraveling the knot of frustration that had built up in his chest. "Maybe," Daniel muttered, more to himself than to Tom, "but I still don't know if it was the right choice." Tom leaned forward, his eyes serious. "You don't have to have all the answers, Daniel. Sometimes the right choice isn't about figuring everything out. It's about trusting yourself to make it through. You made the decision that felt right for you, and that's all that matters." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He just sat there, absorbing the weight of his friend's words. For the first time in days, he felt a small sliver of clarity. He had made the choice. It was his to live with. Maybe, just maybe, he didn't need to understand everything right away. The sound of the rain tapping against his window was the only noise that filled the small apartment. Daniel sat at the kitchen table, the empty coffee cup in front of him, a reminder of how little he had slept. It had been days since he walked away from her, days since he left Carter's garage with the weight of everything she had said pressing down on him. He tried to shake it off, but the confusion, the anger, the hurt, it lingered. He didn't regret leaving, but it still didn't feel right. He hadn't expected to hear from her again. After all, what could she possibly say now? There was nothing she could do to change the way things had ended. He had made his decision, and it was final. But then there was a knock at the door. At first, Daniel ignored it, thinking it was the wind, a branch tapping against the window, anything but the reality that someone might actually be standing there. When the knock came again, louder this time, he stood up, his heart racing before he even reached the door. He opened it, and there she was. Eleanor. Her hair was wet, her clothes soaked through, the rain still falling heavily behind her, but her expression was different. No pretenses, no walls, just raw, unguarded vulnerability. "Daniel," she started, her voice cracking just slightly. She took a breath before she continued. "I've been trying to figure out how to make this right, how to fix what I broke. But I've realized something." She stepped inside before he could say anything, her eyes never leaving his. "I don't need to fix anything. I just need to be honest with you. No tests, no games. I've been playing them my whole life, and I thought maybe, just maybe, you'd be different. I thought if I tried hard enough, I could make you see me for who I am, not just the person I'm forced to be. But I was wrong. I was afraid to let anyone in, because all I've ever known is people who wanted something from me." Daniel stood frozen, the words hitting him like a wave, overwhelming and painful, but real. She wasn't asking for forgiveness, not yet, but there was something in her eyes, something that told him she was trying to give him what he had always wanted, honesty. "I don't need you to save me, Daniel," she said softly. "I don't need you to prove that I'm worth anything, but I do need you to know who I am, what I am. Not the wealth, not the name, just me." The silence between them stretched on, each second pulling at the fragile thread that still connected them. Daniel felt the weight of her words, felt the truth in them, and for the first time he could see the woman beneath the polished surface, beneath the walls she had built. He wasn't sure if he could forgive her yet, but in that moment he realized something important. She was finally seeing him for who he was too, not just the mechanic, not just the man who fixed cars, but the person who had walked away, who had chosen his own integrity over the chance for something more. "I'm sorry," she whispered, taking a step forward, her voice almost lost in the silence. "I know I hurt you, but I'm here now. No more games, just me." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time, and in that moment, he realized that maybe, just maybe, there was a chance for something real after all. Eleanor sat in her car, parked across from Carter's garage, the engine turned off, the dim interior light casting shadows on her face. She had told herself she'd come up with something big, some grand gesture that would prove to Daniel how serious she was. But as she sat there, staring at the small, familiar shop, she realized that no amount of wealth, no grand gestures or expensive gifts could ever fix what she had broken. What she needed to offer wasn't something she could buy. She couldn't fix this with money. She had already tried that, hadn't she? The check, the gifts. Everything had felt wrong because they weren't what he needed. He didn't want her money, her status, or anything she could offer in a box tied with a ribbon. He needed something real. And that was exactly what she hadn't given him. She was tired of hiding behind the walls of her world, tired of pretending she had all the answers when, deep down, she was just as lost as he was. So, for once, she decided to take the risk, to lay down her defenses and offer something that had nothing to do with her wealth. Eleanor got out of the car and walked across the rain-slicked pavement, her shoes splashing through the puddles. But she didn't care. She wasn't here to be perfect. She wasn't here to be someone she wasn't. She was just here to be honest. She stepped into the garage, the faint glow of the overhead lights casting a soft halo around her as Daniel looked up from under the hood of a car. His eyes widened when he saw her, his face betraying surprise, maybe even a little confusion. "You came back," he said, his voice low, cautious. "I came back because I need you to know something," she replied, her voice steady but the words heavier than she expected. "I didn't come here to buy your trust. I didn't come here to fix everything with the things I can throw money at. What I want to give you, Daniel, is time, and my trust, because I see you now, really see you." Daniel didn't move, didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, like he was trying to read her. She stood there, waiting, letting the silence stretch between them. "I'm not asking for you to forgive me," she continued, the words coming out more softly now, more vulnerable. "I'm not asking you to forget what I've done, but I need you to know that I'm here for the right reasons. For once, I'm not hiding, not behind my name, not behind my wealth. Just me, just who I am, and who I want to be with you." The quiet in the garage thickened, the noise of the world outside fading into the background. Daniel didn't say anything for a long while, but his eyes softened, the harshness from before gone, replaced with something else, something uncertain but real. He finally spoke, his voice rough. "You've been playing a dangerous game, Eleanor." "I know," she said, stepping closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "And I've lost. But I'm not playing anymore. If you'll let me, I want to be someone real in your life. No more games, no more tests. Just me and you, for however long it takes." Daniel didn't answer right away, but for the first time, she didn't need him to. She could see it in his eyes, the way he was processing, the way the walls he had put up were slowly starting to crack, and that was enough. For now. The rain had stopped, but the air still carried the weight of it, thick and heavy, as Eleanor stood in the doorway of Carter's garage watching Daniel work. He was bent over an old engine, his hands moving with the kind of ease that only came from years of experience. There was something magnetic about the way he moved, quiet, purposeful, confident. But there was also something worn about him, something that spoke to long hours and hard decisions. She had seen it before in the faces of people who were used to fighting for every scrap of success they had earned. She had come here to offer him something more than just money. But she had to be careful. She couldn't just throw it at him. She couldn't expect him to accept what he didn't want or need. "Daniel," she called, stepping into the shop, her voice soft but firm enough to make him pause. His head snapped up, and for a moment his eyes locked with hers, filled with the quiet tension that had lingered between them for days. "What do you want, Eleanor?" he asked, his voice laced with caution. He was still wary of her, and she didn't blame him. After everything that had happened, after the games she had played, she had no right to expect his trust. But she wasn't here to play games anymore. "I've been thinking about this a lot," she said, walking toward him slowly. "And I realized something. You don't need charity. You don't need me to throw money at you and fix your problems. What you need is a partnership." Daniel's expression didn't change, but he set the wrench down on the workbench, his brow furrowing slightly. "A partnership?" "Yes," she nodded, her voice steady. "I want to help you grow this place, your shop, your business, but I don't want to take away your independence. I don't want to change what you've built. You've done it on your own, and I respect that. But I also know that with the right resources, with a little push, you could make this place something bigger than just a garage in a small town." He looked at her, his skepticism clear, but there was no anger in his eyes, just wariness. "What kind of push are we talking about?" "I'm not talking about handing you a check or buying you out," she said, stepping closer, feeling the weight of every word she spoke. "What I'm offering is something more. I want to help you expand, reach more people, but I want you to have control over how it happens. I want to invest in the business, not just as a financial backer, but as a partner. You make the decisions, you set the pace. I'll support you in whatever way you need, but this is yours. Always yours." He was quiet for a long moment, and for a fleeting second, Eleanor wondered if she had made a mistake, if he would walk away from the offer and from her once again. But then, slowly, he spoke. "Why? After everything, why would you want to do this for me?" "Because I believe in what you've built here," she said, her voice quiet but filled with conviction. "And I believe in you. You've worked harder than most people I know, and I want to see you succeed, not because of what I can give you, but because of what you can do on your own." Daniel met her eyes, and for the first time since she'd walked into the garage, she saw something shift in him, a crack in the armor he had worn so tightly for so long. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice rough but not dismissive. "But I'm not going to make any promises." "I'm not asking you to," she replied. "I'm just giving you the choice." And in that moment, Eleanor realized that maybe, just maybe, she had finally given him something real, something that didn't come with strings attached, something he could trust. The first time they worked together, it wasn't about business. It wasn't about her money or his mechanics. It was about something else entirely, something neither of them had expected when they first met. They were standing side by side, their hands covered in grease, the engine of a 1960s Mustang in pieces on the workbench in front of them. Eleanor had insisted they start with something simple, a car that needed more than just repairs, something that could be used to help people who couldn't afford to fix their own cars. She had come up with the idea weeks ago, but only now, standing in the middle of Carter's garage, did it feel like it was really happening. She wasn't just a wealthy woman trying to fix everything with a check. And he wasn't just the mechanic with a small-town shop trying to keep the lights on. Together, they were doing something real, something bigger than both of them. They were breathing life back into a car that would go to someone in need, a single mother who couldn't afford a new vehicle, a veteran who had been saving every penny just to get by. As they worked side by side, Daniel caught sight of Eleanor's hands as they carefully placed a new part into the engine. Her fingers were delicate, but there was a strength to the way she moved, something that felt grounded, like she wasn't trying to escape or prove anything. She was here, in this moment with him, not trying to impress or change anything, just working. "What made you want to do this?" Daniel asked, his voice breaking the silence between them. "You've got money, you've got a name. You could have just written a check and been done with it." Eleanor paused, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand. "I've spent so much of my life surrounded by people who only care about what I can give them. This feels different. It feels real." She looked up at him, meeting his gaze. "I've been given so many things that don't mean anything. I just wanted to do something that mattered." Daniel didn't respond right away. He focused on tightening a bolt, not wanting to show her the tightness in his chest, the strange feeling in his gut that this was it. This was the moment. He had never imagined that he'd find someone like Eleanor, someone who didn't just want to save the world with money, but who genuinely wanted to help, who could see beyond the surface. And in that moment, he realized something. They were both here for the same reason, not for the fame or the wealth or the recognition, but to do something that made a real difference, to restore something, whether it was an engine, a car, or a life that had been broken. By the time they had finished the Mustang, it wasn't just a car anymore. It was a symbol of what they had built together, a partnership not defined by who had what, but by the willingness to work together and give something back. The car was no longer a project. It was a reward, a real one. And it wasn't just for the person who would drive away in it. It was for both of them. The morning sun cast a warm glow over Carter's garage, but Daniel didn't notice it. He was too focused on the work ahead. It wasn't the same small, cluttered shop he had inherited from his father anymore. This place was growing, evolving, and it wasn't just because the cars were getting more expensive or the repairs more complex. It was because Daniel had finally realized that he didn't need to stay stuck in the same cycle. The first thing he did after Eleanor's offer was to take a step back and breathe. She had given him a choice, a chance to take the business to the next level, but she hadn't tried to control it. She hadn't shoved money at him or asked for anything in return. It was a partnership, a real one. She had shown him that with the right support, with a little bit of guidance, he could actually make this work without compromising what he valued. He started small, new tools, a better layout in the shop. He used the knowledge Eleanor had given him, the strategies she had shared, but it was all on his own terms. No investors, no strings. He was building this business with his own hands, just like his father had done. But this time, he wasn't doing it alone. The space expanded, the walls slowly filling with the hum of new engines and the familiar scent of motor oil, but the shop still felt like home. It still had that same grounded, hands-on energy. But now, there were customers waiting in line, and the phone was ringing more often. The jobs were getting bigger, more complex, and so was his team. He hired a few extra hands, local guys who shared his vision, and weren't afraid to get dirty. But it wasn't just about the business anymore. It was about building something that meant something, something that would make a real difference in his community. They started working on projects that weren't just about profit, but about giving back, fixing cars for those who couldn't afford it, helping families, veterans, single parents. The work was hard, but it was fulfilling in a way that Daniel had never known before. One evening, as he stood outside his shop, watching the glow of the lights reflecting off the wet pavement, he finally allowed himself to feel something he hadn't in a long time: hope. For the first time, Daniel knew that this, his garage, his work, his community, wasn't just a means to an end. It was a place where he belonged, where he could be proud of what he had built. Eleanor had given him the space to grow, but it was him, his hands, his work ethic, his integrity, that had turned this place into something new. He didn't need her money, not anymore. What he needed was the freedom to make his own decisions, and that was exactly what he had now. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the garage, Daniel finally understood. This was his rebirth. And it wasn't just about a business. It was about him. And for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. The shop was quieter now, the hum of engines and clanking tools replaced by the soft rustle of paper and the occasional quiet conversation between Daniel and his crew. The work had become routine in a way that felt good, steady, and fulfilling, but there was more to it now. More than just repairs, more than just the cars that came and went. Eleanor had become a constant presence, not just as a business partner, but as something more. It wasn't the flashy dinners or the high-end events anymore. It wasn't about the suits or the name tags. Their time together had moved beyond all of that. What mattered now was the shared silence between them as they worked on an engine together, the quiet understanding that passed between them when words weren't necessary. Eleanor had come to the garage every chance she got, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She was there not with her wealth, but with her presence. There were no expectations, no pretense, just her. A simple pair of gloves, and the same determination in her eyes that Daniel saw in his own reflection every morning. One evening, after they had wrapped up a long day, she lingered by the back of the shop, looking over the progress they had made. The space had grown, yes, but so had they. Their partnership had become something solid, built not on anything she could offer financially, but on trust, respect, and a shared understanding of what it meant to work hard for something that mattered. "You know," Daniel said, wiping his hands on a rag as he joined her, "when I first started this, I didn't think much would ever change. I thought this place was just going to be the same old thing. But it's different now." Eleanor turned to him, her eyes soft but intense. "I think it's different because you've made it different. You've given it life again." He smiled, a rare, genuine smile that reached his eyes. "I didn't do it alone." There was a pause, and for a moment they just stood there together, the weight of everything they had been through and built between them settling in the air. There was no need for fancy words, no need to dress up what was already so clearly understood. "I never thought I could have something like this," Eleanor said quietly, her voice almost lost in the soft breeze. "I've always been surrounded by people who wanted something from me, and I've spent so much time trying to protect myself, I forgot what it felt like to just be, to just work for something because it's worth it." Daniel reached out, placing a hand on her shoulder, grounding her in that moment. "You don't have to protect yourself anymore, not here." She smiled, her hand resting over his, a silent acknowledgement of everything they had shared. For the first time in a long time, Eleanor didn't feel like she had to prove anything. And for Daniel, the walls he'd built around himself had finally started to come down. They were no longer two separate worlds trying to collide. They were one, built on something real, something stronger than any status or money could provide. They didn't need anything else. Not anymore. Eleanor sat on the worn couch in the back office of Carter's garage, the glow of the single desk lamp casting a soft light on the cluttered room. The air was thick with the smell of oil and metal, but it didn't feel like work today. Today, it felt like home. She had spent so much of her life running from the idea of needing someone, believing that love and connection could be bought, that she could surround herself with people who would appreciate her for her status, her wealth, her power. But none of it had ever been enough. It had taken time, more time than she was willing to admit, to realize what she had been doing wrong. She thought she could buy affection, buy understanding, buy what she had never felt as a child, as a woman growing up in a world that only cared about appearances. She had been taught to believe that love was something to be earned with the right price. But standing in the quiet of the garage, looking around at the place Daniel had built, she saw it for what it really was. None of it had ever mattered. Daniel had never wanted anything from her, no money, no favors, no recognition. He had given her his trust, his time, and in return, he had let her in. Not because she was Eleanor Sinclair, but because she was simply Eleanor. She looked up when she heard him step into the room, the soft sound of his boots on the floor, the quiet hum of the garage, still buzzing faintly in the background. He was covered in grease and sweat, but there was something different about him now, something that hadn't been there when they first met. She realized then that it wasn't just his work that had changed, it was their connection. He had cracked open something inside her that she hadn't known was closed. "Everything all right?" he asked, his voice steady, warm, and always there when she needed it. She nodded, feeling the weight of her own thoughts, the walls she had built around herself, slowly crumbling. "Yeah," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. I've been thinking. About everything." Daniel set the toolbox down on the desk, watching her carefully, his expression unreadable, but kind. He didn't push her. He never did. "I've spent so much time trying to protect myself," she continued, her voice catching slightly. "I thought if I kept everything perfect, if I kept the money and the status, people would love me for the right reasons. But all it ever did was make me feel more alone." Daniel walked over and sat down next to her, close but not too close. His presence was steady, comforting. "You don't have to protect yourself from me," he said simply, his words cutting through the noise in her mind like a thread, pulling everything back into place. "I don't care about your money. I never did." Eleanor felt a lump in her throat, a mix of relief and regret. She had kept herself at arm's length for so long, afraid that if she allowed someone to love her, they would only love the version of her that she had created. But Daniel, with all his quiet strength and authenticity, had seen through it. "I know," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "and that's the only thing that matters." They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of her confession hanging in the air, and for the first time Eleanor felt something inside her shift. She wasn't just a woman with money. She wasn't just a woman with a name that opened doors. She was someone worth loving, someone who could love without the price tag. And in that moment, she realized that all the wealth in the world meant nothing without someone to share it with, without someone who saw her not for the things she had, but for who she really was. The garage was quiet that evening, the usual hum of machinery replaced by the soft rustling of papers and the faint sound of the wind tapping against the windows. Daniel stood near the back of the shop, his hands covered in grease, as he carefully worked on an engine, his mind somewhere else entirely. It had been a long day, a good day, but his thoughts kept drifting to her, the woman who had walked into his life unexpectedly, shaking up everything he thought he knew about himself, about love, about trust. Eleanor had been with him through it all. She had seen him at his lowest, when he was drowning in debt and doubt. And she had stayed, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Slowly, their relationship had grown into something deeper, something real, something that couldn't be measured by money or status. It was about the work they did together, the shared vision, the quiet moments when words weren't necessary, when the only thing that mattered was the feeling of being seen for who they really were. He wiped his hands on a rag, his heart pounding in his chest. He had something important to do. He walked to the back shelf where a small box sat hidden under some old blueprints. Inside was a ring, no diamonds, no extravagant stones, just a simple band with a small, carefully crafted piece of metal on it. It was a ring made from an old wrench, a symbol of where it all began, this shop, his work, their shared journey. He had spent weeks on it, melting down the old wrench, shaping it into something beautiful, something that represented the transformation they had gone through together. It was imperfect, just like them, but it was theirs. Eleanor had always told him that money meant nothing without love, that real wealth came from the heart, from the connections we make with others. He didn't need a diamond to prove anything to her. What mattered was the life they had built, the trust, and the partnership they had forged in the midst of it all. He walked to the front of the shop, the ring heavy in his pocket. Eleanor was sitting on the stool near the counter, staring out at the now empty street, her expression distant. For a moment, Daniel just watched her, the woman who had become his rock, his equal. "I've been thinking," he started, his voice quieter than he intended. Eleanor looked up, her eyes softening when they met his. She knew something was coming. "About us," he continued, walking toward her slowly. "About everything we've been through, everything we've built. And I've realized something." Her breath caught, and she stood up, her expression unreadable. "I don't have much to offer," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I have this." He pulled the ring from his pocket, holding it out to her. "This is us. Everything we've done, everything we've been through, and everything we will be." Eleanor looked at the ring, her fingers tracing the rough edges, the symbol of their journey. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at it, as if trying to make sense of the simple yet profound gesture. "Will you marry me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. For a long moment there was silence, and then, slowly, Eleanor reached for the ring, her eyes glistening. "Yes," she said softly. "Yes, Daniel. 1,000 times, yes." And in that moment, as they stood together in the same garage where their journey had begun, Daniel realized that it wasn't the size of the ring that mattered. It was the meaning behind it, the love, the trust, and the life they had built together.